Okay, wonderful. So, hello, recording. Welcome to the Soil Ontologies cluster call. And I'm here. I'm going to be introducing Emilio Mayorga. So, Emilio is a scientist, an environmental informatics practitioner at the University of Washington Applied Physics Laboratory in Seattle. It sounds like many people on this call are really familiar with Emilio, which is great. But I think importantly to note is that Emilio's science background is in aquatic biogeochemistry, hydrology, and oceanography, and with a PhD specifically in chemical oceanography. But nowadays, he focuses on the development and implementation of systems for the management and open dissemination of environmental data in marine and terrestrial applications. And his work emphasizes collaborative approaches and tools that engage diverse partners. And this work ranges from sort of local partners in the Pacific Northwest to national and global applications. And he's one of the developers of ODM2, the observations data model. ODM2 is an information model and supporting software ecosystem for feature-based Earth observations, designed to facilitate interoperability across scientific disciplines and domain cyber infrastructures. So a great way to sort of bridge back to soils, of course. So Emilio, I think from here you can take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. You've done part of my job already. So we'll start there. And first, I wanted to do a whirlwind tour of ODM2 and then focus on one application that I was involved in that was focused directly on soils. Our goal was, I think it's helpful to restate our goal when we're developing ODM2 is to better integrate, and that's important, I think, and manage sensor and sample-based data. I really want to emphasize that, the need to manage those often divergent types of data that are both common nowadays as part of our toolbox for greater interoperability across disciplines and domain cyber infrastructures. So that need would involve managing sensor time series, sample analysis, water and soils data in a single informatics platform, if you will. And it built, as Anthony has and Jeff have mentioned, it built on prior developments of ODM1 and other community efforts. I've listed the leads of ODM2, but I'll highlight it in red are the people who are here, well, other than me. And I'm really bummed that Miguel Leon couldn't make it. I think he has the strongest soils experience with and direct soils experience with ODM2. So if you're interested in ODM2 and soils, definitely want to touch base with him. Just quickly through for reference, these are our two papers that we have published.
Hold on 1 second, Emilio. I'm not seeing your slide switching. I don't know if anybody else is.
Oh no.
But if you meant for that to happen, you might have to go into presentation mode.
I am in presentation mode.
Okay.
I think we're not seeing your other screen.
Mode. I'm sorry. What's? Can someone tell me what?
We're not seeing your presentation mode. We're just seeing your slide deck and the ribbon next to it.
Okay. So. Sorry. I will change my sharing to share the whole desktop.
Which is always a very brave thing.
Yeah, I prefer. That's okay. Tell me if it works then.
Yes.
Okay.
That looks great.
Sorry about that. Well, I won't rehash this. These are the two key papers that we have published, but I wanted to highlight also that link at the bottom. That was a workshop where that we had in 2017, where we presented ODM2 as well. And these slides, its first 2/3 of the presentation are all taken from a ODM2 presentation from Jeff at that workshop, which is available there. And there are other ODM2 materials in there. As Anthony mentioned, ODM2 benefited from the inputs of many Earth surface scientists via our engagement at the time with the Critical Zone Observatory and EarthCube. And that included people from multiple domains, as well as cyber infrastructure experts from different perspectives. As part of the ODM2 development process, we hosted a series of community design and prototyping workshops over 2 years. This was 5 years ago or so. This is the outcome. ODM2 is an information model. It is what we call the practical profile for OGC's observations and measurements. Here we illustrated, and during the development, we focused on an sort of relational database focused entity relationship diagrams. There are multiple physical implementations, file, database, and object. I'll focus primarily on the database implementation, and this is a somewhat higher level, not complete, but shows the core concept, I guess, of ODM2 that includes the sampling features, the people and organizations, methods, actions, which is a central but concept that can be somewhat fuzzy, results, variables, and so on. It is, or can be, a relational database, and we developed the infrastructure to support multiple relational database management systems, though that's been a challenge. It is also a software and tools ecosystem. We also developed at the same time a series of tools, and most of this is Python, if not all, it was Python-based. So either low-level programming tools like APIs, or user-facing GUI, desktop, or web-based tools and web services. Now, the level of maturity of any one of these is highly variable, and I'll get to that later. Some core terminology, and on the left you have the OGC O&M document, and some of the concepts that are core to ODM2 borrow directly from O&M, that's sampling feature, that it's a concept that it can encompass both a site as well as a specimen. In other words, the chunk of soil that you grab is labeled a specimen. If you then subdivide it into 2 sub-chunks, that each of those are also a specimen. The result or the outcomes of an observation, the methods, in other words, how you did something, and so on. One of the elements that we developed as well, building on the ODM1 experience, was an ODM2 controlled vocabulary registry. So the ODM2 has a series of vocabularies that are managed via a series of controlled vocabularies. As an example, to represent the site that has specimen and sampling features, a site, hopefully you see my cursor, multiple sampling or observation activities may happen, and often happen really, at a single site. And bear in mind that most of us were water oriented. So many of our examples are water based. So that you may have a stream gauge, a sensor that records at high frequency. There may be a weather station nearby also, like right next to it. On the shore, there may be an observation well. And we may collect specimens of water or sediments. So we want to be able to relate everything to the single site in a consistent way, while also being able to represent the distinct features of each of those observations. So sampling features can be typed as a site or a specimen, and can be related among one another. For example, a specimen was collected at a site. The results are of different types, whether it's a time series or a measurement. In other words, a measurement is what the type that results from a sample, a transect or a depth profile. All of those are associated with consistent descriptions of space, time, measurements, and people and organizations and variables and so on. This is an example of a common, this is the common description for results across all the types, and the custom form of the results was shown here, depending on whether the results are measurements, time series, or so on. A use case that is more relevant here, the management of discrete observations. In other words, a sample, a soil sample. We have water here, but substitute soils there. What is needed typically is to organize the observations in a consistent way, in a ideally, if possible, in a single system. You want to be able to describe the sites, the specimens, what variables are used, what methods you used, and what observations were carried out. Describe the sample collection effort and the field processing methods, and how bottles were handled, and what preservation treatments were used. And once you analyze the samples and stored it, you want to be able to use the data conveniently, visualize it, and so on, and publish it. So to continue that example, for a fixed site, we may collect a specimen, a water bottle in this case, and we need to know the time, and eventually we'll have results, the actual thing we're interested in, or variable. And the data entry might look like this. Multiple investigators may be collecting and analyzing samples that are part of your team. A data manager, depending on the size of your gig, may work with those investigators to aggregate the data. And with ODM2, you may use a direct SQL connection to load the data, or at a slightly higher level, the API that we developed, or this data loader that we developed at some point. So in other words, there are multiple ways of entering the data into a database. The sampling workflow may look like this, that samples are collected, and you record the collection method, date, time, location, who did what, method collection and preservation methods, and then sample splitting, and keeping track of that split and those relationships, how the samples are prepared and processed, and the methods and people and specifics of the analysis. And that tracking of information, it's schematically looks like this. An action, or this is the infrastructure that is used. An action is performed at a sampling feature using a method. And actions can be related to one another. And they generate a result. And the results have a variable, units, and processing levels. Another way of looking at this is that each action has an action. If you collect a sample at a site, different or multiple samples, different processing chains may happen. This is a straightforward single processing chain. And this is a case, this two here, well, this one is a case where you collect a single sample, but then you split it. And those two splits undergo different sample preparation for different analysis. But you want to be able to preserve that linkage, that these two results are actually related ultimately to the same sample. Once you have the data nicely stored in ODM2, the mechanisms for accessing it include this ODM2 API and web service APIs that we developed, again, with different levels of maturity. Where is ODM2 used? And this may be out of date, by the way. These slides were created a couple of years ago. I know this one is not out of date because Anthony, well, Anthony is leading this project and Jeff was involved in its development, and I'm involved as well. It's a citizen scientist registered data collection device. This is focused on sensor data, but not exclusively. I believe there are hundreds of sites in this ODM2 implementation in this database. And if I remember correctly, and Anthony can chime in later after at the end, something like a couple hundred million observations. But again, these are all primarily sensor data. HydroShare, that Jeff is one of the leads, at least a couple of years ago, was supporting ODM2 for time series data via SQLite files. Don't know where things stand today. This is from Jeff directly. He can speak more about that. Water quality sample data management for water quality sample data. And this is Miguel Leon. Like I said, I'm really bummed that he couldn't make it. Miguel developed this web-based interface called formerly called ODM2 Admin, now called Critical Zone Manager, to leverage ODM2 capabilities and manage both time series or sensor data and data derived from specimens, be it water or soil. It's based on Django. There's the link, though we're going to share that later as well. And in addition to the key sites that he's directly involved in, that's Lukio, LTER, and other related projects that formerly the Lukio CCO, I guess. And the Trace project, I believe he's working with, or he has worked with a couple of other groups and implemented the same thing in ODM2 database and the CC manager for those groups, but I'm not in a position to talk about that. Those are screenshots. This CC manager allows you to manage the data, but also visualize it. Someone mentioned Kirsten Leonard, and I had it at the list as being one of the leads of ODM2 the development. EarthChem, hopefully some of you are familiar with EarthChem. It's not quite an ODM2 direct, an exact ODM2 implementation. We diverged a while ago, but the core concepts and structures in the EarthChem database or data system are based on ODM2. So thought that was worth mentioning. Switching gears, I wanted to focus on this project that I was involved in that was completely focused on soils. It's the Zymea project funded by EarthCube, the critical zone integrated microbial ecology activity. And those the objectives were to enable the critical zone community to use EarthCube software via training workshops, to synthesize critical zone biogeochemistry and microbial ecology data for EarthCube software validation. If you're familiar with EarthCube, I want to highlight that in this project, we actually got funds to do a honest to goodness, very interesting science and collect new data. That's unusual for an EarthCube project. And we wanted to use that exercise of that end-to-end actual real science effort to identify the cyber infrastructure needs at every stage. And to test and improve EarthCube cyber infrastructure for multi-scale, multidisciplinary geosciences. We coordinated with the different CCOs and developed a common sampling scheme focused on microbial ecology. In other words, what samples were going to be collected and how, and then centralized a couple of labs, 2 or 3, I forget, or 4, where the analysis would be made in a single lab for a particular set of results or analytes. And those are the papers that have come out so far. I'm not going to go through the text of the lab, but I just wanted to highlight that plot. It ought to give you a good idea that this stuff gets complicated when you have an integrative study that is trying to measure multiple things in order to better understand your questions at hand. And microbial ecology involves physical, chemical, and biological processes. So I'm sure this is not extremely rare. We started out with the CCO area, and then we had 2 sites. One was disturbed and the other one undisturbed. At each site, there would be one core or soil profile. Within that, there would be core sections or horizons, the soils within each depth range that would be collected. Each of those core sections would then be split in multiple ways. And this is the standardized set of subsamples that were defined. And of course, each of those would undergo different treatments and then different analysis done at different labs. Gets confusing, but again, like I said, I think this is probably somewhat representative of the more ambitious sampling efforts. From the cyber infrastructure perspective, we wanted to facilitate cross-CCO project intercomparison research and try to have strong provenance throughout. We wanted to guide the management of expected project data and metadata while data was being collected. And that was, in the end, overly ambitious. And we wanted to create and populate a unified data store holding consistent, rich metadata that consistently describe this environment, the environmental data. And here we made an exception of genomic data, which was also critical to this, but that was deemed to not fit within ODM2 directly. An important aspect of being able to maintain this connectivity of information was persistent identifiers from different community resources. We're trying to demonstrate and exemplify best practices. The part of this linkages to community resources included connections to well, community resources like the IGSNs. Hopefully many of you are familiar with the IGSNs, the International Geological Sample Number, and GERAS, that's the Genomic Standards Consortium. Well, it's a metagenomic system, and the standards associated with that, well, and other resources. Why ODM2 for this project? Its goals align with the Zymea's broad interoperability and goals. There were partnerships with hydrology and geochemistry that made a lot of sense. Plus, I was a co-PI on both Zymea and ODM2. One of the resources or tools that we developed was via Jupyter Notebook, the code that used ODM2 API, Python API to load data. Basically, this consisted of identifying the Excel files and CSV files that were being generated by multiple labs to try to develop the code that would upload this into the complex data structures or schema used by ODM2. This aspect got only so far as loading all the information about people and their organizations and the sample collection effort. For that aspect, I would say it got pretty thorough. Well, I'll say more about this in a bit. We also were working towards attributing sort of the environmental context of each location and developing code to automate the assignment of things like land cover type, topography, climate, and USDA soil taxonomy. We adopted the Critical Zone Manager tool from Miguel Leon, and were able to make some advancements to it. So this is what it might look like at one site. We had a profile, and that profile had multiple, in this case, these are labeled as specimens, but basically the core sections. So this is a pop-up in that GUI that, well, the whole system is based on ODM2. You can see that the sampling feature type is a specimen. The specimen type is a core section. We could have called it a horizon, but there are reasons for that more geological lingo. The specimen medium is a soil. In other words, this is coming from the controlled vocabularies. And then more direct information. We assigned IGSNs. So here's the IGSN for that core section with the linkage directly to CSAR. And this is direct specimen is linked directly to the ODM2 controlled vocabulary. And we're able to, because of the effort that goes into capturing those relationships, you can see here that this soil section has as its parent the profile, which has its own IGSN, has siblings, the other cross sections in the profile with their own IGSNs, and the children are the subsamples, A, B, C, etc. Each of those also had its own IGSN. This is what it would look like on the Critical Zone Manager with at a site, then the view for core or profile, and the view we were just seeing, the core section, with additional information about methods and external resources related to methods. Unfortunately, I think I got overly ambitious, and we were very close to, and other things happened in the project, but we were very close to being able to explore further linkages across systems, and then funding ran out, I guess. We did have a very good connection with IGSN. We didn't get it, things stopped, I guess, before we were able to design a robust soil fraction scheme for ODM2. In other words, to take the data that was collected and the actual result and fully ingest it into ODM2. I was really bummed about that, but we were juggling results that were still being generated and being delayed, because that's life, with trying to multiple Excel files in different forms. And that became untenable. In my mind, issues of sample fractioning and sample processing in soils have very strong parallels with what you do in water samples and analysis, as Anthony kind of alluded to. And that's something I really wanted to explore. So is ODM2 for you? Well, I would say, think about what your key needs are. Do you collect both? I should have emphasized both sample-based and sensor-based data or time series data. If you do, I would say give ODM2 a good look. Do you conduct research only in soils or also in other environments? Is ODM2 primarily for managing your own data versus managing compilations or synthesis? Well, in principle, it can meet differing needs. I think it generally ends up being, it has many facilities for data, for compiling and managing your own data. That may be overkill for data synthesis, but it also has advantages. And think about the pros and cons of fairly generalized systems like ODM2 versus something that is highly customized. And I want to point here to ISRAD, or however it's pronounced, the Soil Radiocarbon Database, that does that job really well. But if you're also interested in radiocarbon from water, from rivers and streams, you run into limitations. But so I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but it's I think it depends on your broader goal for your data management needs. Where does ODM2 stand today? That integrative need that we try to address are just as important today, if not more so. It's used actively by several small teams and in a couple of large projects, but the funding, the direct funding for the group ended in around 2018, if not 2017. And since then, I would say that public common development has stalled. One measure of that is GitHub. Our GitHub repos have had little activity since then. But active development is happening by us individually with occasional communication. So it's being very actively used in some cases in large systems, but that progress as a group has stalled, I would say. And hopefully Jeff and Anthony can chime in later and give their own perspectives as we answer questions from all of you. Thank you. And I had prepared this other little slide, so I'm just going to put it in there that a lifetime ago, when I was an active or aquatic biogeochemist, this need to have carbon fractions, to think about how to store and represent highly processed and subsampled carbon was near and dear to my heart. So that was a motivator for me all along with ODM2. Thank you.
Yay, great.
And I stuck to 30 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Emilio. So yeah, so I think at this point in the process, we'll take some clarifying questions, any maybe specific responses still on recording, and then we'll end the recording for any general discussion. So I think best way, we have 13 folks, so feel free to just unmic yourself if you have questions, but if you want, you can also put them in the chat and I can call on you.
Suzanne has her hand raised.
Suzanne, great. Suzanne, please.
So this all looks really cool. I'm wondering, how big of a challenge is it to make sure that all the collaborators who are doing all of the actual sampling and the lab analyses give you enough information on their methods, et cetera, that you can integrate all of it together effectively?
So that's a bit of a sociological and management question, I suppose. I think you need to have common agreement, that develop common templates, for example, that will go a long way. I don't care what the template looks like, as long as it's common and people stick to it. Some way also of, I don't want to say enforcement, but verification and some sense of common purpose. But, you know, as everyone knows, with Excel is the common medium for all of this. It is so easy to write little comments here and there, change things here and there. I don't have a good solution to that. I mean, short of investing major effort to develop a highly customized system where people enter data into a form, and that's not everyone can manage to do that. So if you have to depend on Excel files being passed around or stored in a common place, it takes diligence and persistence to ensure that that information is filled out properly, and so on.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question to Suzanne's. If you're developing common templates, I assume that your whole system is also kind of modular and can be expanded, or can include more things as they come up, more parameters. And I guess the reason this is sort of a follow-up to Suzanne's question is, what about things like chain of custody or legal issues that might come up with some of the sample collection? And do you have a data parameter for that, or could you add one?
Yeah, I'll start with the last set of things you mentioned. The chain of custody, there is a built-in core set of, because of the relationships that are built in, of who, and the association with individuals and institutions. So every step or action is associated with a person who's associated with an organization. Beyond that, I would say that we have an extension mechanism. I'm not sure that, I certainly was not involved in using that extension mechanism towards hardening chain of custody kind of concerns, but I'll turn to Jeff and Anthony to see if they have something to say or more experience in that regard. Jeff?
I can pipe in.
Okay.
Yeah, so we designed ODM2. We found in our early days of ODM2, when we were interviewing and having workshops with lots of different environmental data managers and pretty much all the disciplines, that there was always like one more thing that someone wanted to add, right? And what that meant was that they were constantly tweaking their data model, and that was causing them to basically have to roll their own software, right? And so a core goal of ODM2 was all about interoperability and data sharing. And so this idea that Emilio just described of extensions, this flexible extension system that we built, it would be exactly the way to put in chain of custody stuff. So we built ODM2 to be exceedingly flexible without breaking the core data model. The core concept of ODM2, because it's a profile of OGC's observations and measurement, is the concept of an observation, which we broke down one step further after talking to Simon Cox into an action and its optional result, right? So there's a verb and what you might get out of it. And so that actions are exceptionally flexible in the way that you don't have to change the data model, and you can use an action to do anything. Basically, an action is a person or organization. You can kind of construct a sentence out of it, with nouns and verbs and objects and subjects. A person or organization applying a method at a given space and time, at a given time on a sampling feature, with the option of producing some type of measurement result. So you don't actually have to have the measurement result, but that ability to have to basically keep track of an action, a person applying a method on a sampling feature at a space and time could be very, very readily adopted toward chain of custody sample tracking. And we did that explicitly.
Jeff, did you have any experience with implementing chain of custody kind of thing?
No, I've not implemented something really specific along those lines. I mean, I realize those issues are very important for a lot of people, but I don't have much to add to what Anthony just said.
Okay.
A quick question. Can the actions also generate further features? Can a feature be a result of an action thingy? That's one of the abstractions which Simon then came up in the SOSA SSM, where he did a very similar modeling between the observation and the sampling process.
I think my answer will be sort of yes and no. The yes part is that maybe I wouldn't use the word generate rather than associate. It's semantics, I suppose. For example, the action of taking one chunk of soil and splitting it into 2 subsamples. We are able to capture, and I capture that type of action in that Zymea project. You could say that that action generated those 2 specimen sampling features. I think in the language we use generally in ODM2, maybe the word we use is not so much generate as here's a new sampling feature and it's associated with this action. But I mean, I'm splitting hairs.
Okay, that's splitting a hair, but I mean, yeah. Can a result be a new specimen sampling feature I could then play with further down the line?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that's what I showed in my example from Zymea, where we had the 10 to 20 centimeter core section. The action of splitting it using a specific method resulted in not so much any measurements, like no carbon measurements, but just 2 new specimen sampling features. And that relationship is
using that to do the sampling. That means actually a lot of your provenance information is implicitly there.
Yes.
And I don't want to cut this amazing discussion off too quickly, but I wanted to just acknowledge that it's top of the hour almost, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording in case anybody wants to chime in with a few other things. So I'm